Hello, everyone. Hello. Okay, yeah, we'll talk. My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm the policy director of Defending Rights in Dissent. Defending Rights in Dissent is an organization that defends your right to know the truth and out. We were founded as the National Committee to abolish the House Un-American Minorities Committee, and in the intermediate century and a half, we have been defending people's right to political expression when the government doesn't want them to have them. Beginning in the 80s and 90s, we've increasingly worked with Palestinian American communities who have been targeted due to prejudice under unconstitutional, draconian anti-terrorism laws. In the 90s, we were very active on the issue of secret evidence being used in immigration courts, as well as the criminalization of humanitarian aid in Palestine. In recent years, there's been a lot of time on the Julian Assange case and the prosecution of journalists under the Espionage Act. And even though we are a purely domestic organization, we recently initiated a call from over 100 journalists and 10 press freedom groups calling on the U.S. to impose an arms embargo on Israel in light of their continuous murder of Palestinian journalists. We feel like if we are going to hold the U.S. government to account for its violations of press freedom, we cannot remain silent when our government makes the assassination of Palestinian journalists possible. Tonight's panel is about the state of press freedom today. I have an excellent group of panelists who have sat out of the order. I have their names here. Thank you very much, everyone. We have Kevin Pistola, the editor of The Dissenter. He's based in Chicago. He curates the Dissenter newsletter. It is the best newsletter on press freedom issues. I frequently rely on it. And he wrote a book on the Assange case, Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange from Censored Press and Seven Stories. We have Seth Stern, who is Director of Advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and we have Nader Mahmoud, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Palestine in America, the only Palestinian publication based in the U.S. People did not pay attention to this. On Thursday of last week, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Free Expression delivered a report to the UN General Assembly about the state of free expression post-Gaza conflict, and one of the things she commented on was the purging of Palestinian American journalists in the Western media. So we're very happy to have you here, and we will not be purging you with your voice. So that is everyone. So let's just go around and start off by asking the question, how do you assess the state of press freedom today, and what do you view as the main challenges to it? Kevin, you've taken that seat, so you have to speak first.
I have to speak first. I haven't started so long. But I'll draw broad strokes, and then I imagine people to my left here, my colleagues, will have some specifics, and we'll be able to take it in some, I imagine, compelling directions. But for me, it's impossible to separate the state of press freedom from what we see happening with the war on Gaza. I think what we're seeing, the issues within the media landscape, what I see, what I'm observing, even when it comes to domestically, I mean, we just had the Democratic National Convention here, and the vast majority of issues when it came to the First Amendment and the repression or the ability of journalists to do their jobs and cover what was happening in the streets, it all stemmed from Palestinian solidarity protests, or people who were opposed to the war, who were marching and dealing with the Chicago police and the way in which they were carrying out security for this, as they call it, national special security event. And so I think, to me, when I look at it, I see the war on Gaza as being defining, and then I also, to me, think of the extent to which we see the Justice Department being able to redefine what it means to be a journalist. So they know, at least particularly with President Joe Biden's administration, that they're supposed to be on the side of human rights and democracy. They're supposed to uphold freedom of the press and these values and they say that they're better than President Donald Trump or former President Donald Trump and the people around him because he wants to go after the press and sees them as enemies of himself. But they want to still bring the same prosecutions. They want to still use the prosecutorial powers that they have in an abusive manner. So when they bring these cases, and a lot of them function like test cases, and we'll get into it in the conversation tonight, they have to include in their filings or the way that they prosecute these individuals notations that that person is not really a journalist. Or they have to go above and beyond to distinguish their conduct in a way that they claim is not journalistic activity. And then from there on, we have discussions and debate. We get pulled into this debate that basically gives them the ability to continue on with these political cases when they shouldn't have actually been brought in the first place. There should be no indictments of these individuals. I'm leaving it unspecific deliberately because I think we'll get into those issues and who we're talking about as the night goes on. Thank you for being here. It's a really good group.
Thanks everyone for being here. And this will probably be the first of many times that I'll say that I agree with Kevin. I think that the Biden administration coming in probably thought press freedom was kind of low-hanging fruit. All they needed to do to get a passing grade on press freedom was not be cartoon villains, not say ridiculous things about locking up journalists and revoking licenses of television networks, all the stuff that Trump did. You know, as long as no reporters get punched at our rally, all good, we win. There would be this Julian Assange thing going on, but that would be sort of a sideshow that only those fringe people who care about Julian Assange are going to pay attention to. In the eyes of mainstream America, we are going to be winners on press freedom because the bar was set so low by the predecessor. And then I think the war in Gaza, and now the rest of Israel's wars, really sort of threw a wrench in that plan, because it put all this journalism is not a crime rhetoric to the test. Journalism is not a crime when you like the journalist. Journalist is not a crime when the journalist stays within the acceptable parameters of what you expect a journalist to do and say. Is journalism still not a crime when you're being challenged on a fundamental level? When the war that you are financing is being challenged by journalists? If journalism is not a crime, then are you going to bankroll efforts to target and kill non-criminals abroad? So it puts the administration in a pretty tough spot where it had to actually back up its rhetoric on press freedom, and so far it's quite miserable. There are other areas where the administration has possibly made some progress on the domestic front. There is now a policy at the DOJ level against surveilling journalists, subpoenaing journalists for their sources. There is legislation, the Press Act, that passed the House unanimously and that has bipartisan support in the Senate that would make that the law and put a stop to surveillance of journalists, hopefully, except for these emergency situations that the legislation carves out, I think as narrowly as could reasonably be expected for it to be politically viable. There is a chance that that might pass this year. There is still some opposition in the Republican Party, but on the other hand, people like Lindsey Graham are for the bill. Ask me why, I have no idea, but I'll take it. So there's a good chance that some progress will be made on press freedom under this administration. It's, a journalist shield bill is something that people have been pushing for since 1972, when the Supreme Court decided the Brandsburg case, which, at least in the context of grand jury proceedings, decided there was no privilege and allowed subsequent courts to limit the privilege further. So that would be a big win for press freedom in the Biden administration. The Assange case is something we're going to talk about more, so I'll sort of hold my comments on that. But whatever policy wins, the administration can claim at the end of the day are not going to make up for what it is bankrolling and its utter failure to meaningfully speak out about its allies' crimes.
Yeah, thanks for being here, guys. Nathan moved from Palestine, America, and what my colleagues have been saying is spot on. But I would like to talk about it more from a Palestinian being in the newsroom. I used to be in more conventional newsrooms before I started Palestine in America, and the things that they are talking about trickle down into the newsroom. It causes fear amongst colleagues who don't want to touch a certain subject because they're fearful of their own job and their job security. I saw most of this when I was in the college paper at Columbia College when I had my own sports column. Even I, like the way journalism was taught to me, objectivity, it means so many different things to so many different people, and it's usually used to suppress journalism, in my opinion, in my experience. Anytime someone's like, you can't be objective because you're Palestinian. I've had newsrooms force me to, at the end of a column, put that I'm Palestinian American. Otherwise, they wouldn't run the column. I had people that I thought, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists who wrote for the Tribune that I thought were my mentors silence me, and that's what caused me to start Palestine. I think that things have gotten much better since I've created my magazine 10 years ago, but there's still things that are going on today, like Julian Assange, that it still trickles down into the news. It's gotten better because I feel like there's more people, like-minded people in those newsrooms that are willing, after seeing journalists being murdered, that you start to think like, okay, my job in the grand scheme of things compared to this person who's risking their life and then being murdered for doing the same job that I'm doing over here, it's causing more people to speak up. I'm in a group, a journalism group for Middle Eastern and North Africans called Avisha, and we're always in that group, and people who are working for these big publications are always fighting in their newsrooms to try to change things, and that's really what's causing the change. These politicians are just playing games with them.
I agree with all of those comments, and the threat that I'm going to hone in on, I'm not going to say it's the greatest threat, but we have governments killing journalists or locking journalists up. But something that has troubled me tremendously over the last year is the selective solidarity we see with press freedom. We will see people condemn correctly Russia's killing of Ukrainian journalists, but they will be completely silent on the assassinations of Palestinian journalists. We will see people talk about the Wall Street Journal reporter who was locked up by the Russians for, I believe, espionage-related charges was the crime, and they will have
Collecting state secrets.
collecting state secrets. So journalists, guilty of journalism. But they will say nothing about Julian Assange, his persecution, or if they do, they'll say, well, he's not really a journalist, but this case can set a bad precedent for someone who really is. I know he is Julian Assange, or is he not a journalist? The debate was quite controversial. My position is he is a journalist, and I agree with the recent finding of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe that he was also a political prisoner, which is a group of U.S. allies, right? A group of NATO member states who are allied with us. Parliamentarians got together and they said Julian Assange's detention met the definition of a political prisoner. You will never hear that in the New York Times. You will never hear that in the Wall Street Journal. And it is very troubling watching people who are in press freedom groups, many of which, like Seth's, are very good. This is not about Seth's group or mine, who are correct to point out press freedom violations when they are carried out by official U.S. enemies, and then sort of boast about working with the State Department on these cases and how close they are to Matt Miller or Anthony Blinken or these other people, and then sort of are silent when Blinken is sending the guns to assassinate Palestinian journalists, when the U.S. is imprisoning a journalist, and that we are being criticized by the UN Special Rapporteur on free expression, the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, 3 successive UN Special Rapporteurs on torture accused the U.S. of torturing someone in relationship to the Chelsea Manning leak, either Manning herself or Julian Assange. You never hear that, do you? That we tortured about 3 different UN torture experts have found us to have tortured people for exposing our war crimes. And this selective solidarity is really troubling. And it was really hard when we were working on the Julian Assange case, and it is still really hard when we're working on the killing a Palestinian journalist. And part of the reason why Defending Rights in Dissent, as a domestic organization, felt the need to intervene in the Palestinian journalist issue, not just because the government was funding it, but because we were seeing a repeat of this selective solidarity, and we knew how to build coalitions around it. At his recent testimony to the Council of Europe, Julian Assange commented that a lot of people, when they look at Ukraine versus Palestinian journalists being killed, they make the decision to speak up or be silent based on their geopolitics. And this selective solidarity is really harming press freedom, and this weaponization of press freedom by the US government, where they take it, not in a good faith way, but as a tool to sort of poke at their enemies. And in almost all of the cases, the enemies are violating press freedom, and not to really speak up on their own commitments. And we've seen over the years where the cause of human rights, a very noble cause, has become really cheapened by our own government's selective use if we want to go to war somewhere. And I really fear we are seeing a repeat of that with press freedom. And some people are, I think illegally and unknowingly, collaborating with the US government in allowing that to happen. It's a very dark comment. So let's move on to the second question of the day. One of the big news items right now is this leak of documents. I believe it is the National Geospatial
Intelligence
Agency.
Yeah.
Some people reported NSA, but not NSA. I believe that was a misreport.
Okay.
About Israel's, what the U.S. knows of Israel's plans to strike Iran, which would be a violation of international law. It's pretty clear from mainstream media reporting these disclosures are actual government documents. CNN, ABC, all of the mainstream press are boasting they are not publishing the documents or quoting directly. Ken Klippenstein, an independent journalist, Dropsite News, and David Camp at antiwar.com have all published the documents. These documents are classified at the top secret level. I would argue that if the US government is violating the War Powers Act and the Constitution to help Israel carry out an act of aggression in violation of the United Nations Charter, there's a pretty big public interest. I'm not in the editorial room of CNN, and I'm not the Department of Justice, so probably they don't agree with me. But I just, since this touches on so many of the themes of tonight, I want to start by talking about this. So Seth, I'm going to give you the first question, and as what is the legal landscape for such disclosures? Can they be lawfully published, and what is the potential, we don't know who gave the information out, but let's say it is a US whistleblower, which there's reasons to believe it's not. What are they looking at?
So in theory, the law would distinguish between the source and the journalist, or the source and the publisher. There's a bit of a conflict between what the Supreme Court has said though, and what the law has said. The Supreme Court has said a journalist is entitled to publish information given to them by a source, even if the source obtained the information illegally, as long as the source didn't participate in the illegality. But then when you're involved in the national security realm, you've got the Espionage Act, which I'm sure we're going to talk about more throughout the night, but it's an archaic statute that essentially makes it a crime to obtain, publish, possess defense information. The statute predates the classification system, so it doesn't even refer to classified documents. So those laws are in conflict. And up until the Assange case, there was sort of an understanding that the Espionage Act would not be used against journalists. Various administrations contemplated using it against journalists, from Nixon convening a grand jury to go after Neil Sheehan, actually, and his wife, over the publication of the Pentagon Papers. I think Ford maybe considered prosecuting Seymour Hersh during the
Glomar.
and during the second George W. Bush administration, there was discussion on television where Alberto Gonzalez floated the idea of prosecuting ABC over publications of classified information. But it never actually happened, because anytime anyone thought about it, people mentioned the First Amendment to the PR disaster that would ensue if you were to do that. Then you got Julian Assange, who, at least in the view of the national security state, is an unsympathetic figure who is, in their view, sort of quasi-journalist / whatever else. And I suppose they were under the impression that they would not draw the same ire from the media establishment for going after Julian Assange as they would for going after the New York Times. And they were right, as Chip said. I think every major news outlet at some point condemned the prosecution of Julian Assange, but in a lot of instances they kind of did it once to check a box, and then they stayed away from it as much as they possibly could. Every once in a while they would revisit, confirm that they still oppose this. They would spend the first 18 paragraphs of the article clearing their throat, talking about what a bad guy Julian Assange is, before they say, and regardless, you shouldn't prosecute him because of the repercussions for others. So anyway, there's a long way of saying the legal landscape is murky for journalists now that Julian Assange has been convicted, a plea deal, but nonetheless a conviction. And there's this case out there that normalizes the notion of prosecuting journalists for publishing government secrets. When you get into a situation like the Iran leak, all of these newspapers that are not going to publish the documents, they're going to say it's a matter of journalistic ethics. They're going to say it's a matter of journalistic norms, that they're making a thought-out, principled decision. And maybe they are, and maybe we just disagree with their principles, but I think it's far more likely that what's really driving them is nervousness about publishing classified documents in light of the Assange prosecution, in light of the new normalization of prosecuting publishers. They don't want to be the first, establishment journalist to get the Assange treatment. And, like many other things, it's a move they're making, they believe, out of necessity for business reasons and you might argue cowardly reasons, that they're, in hindsight, justifying as principled. And it's like, journalistic objectivity and neutrality, the way we see it now, that's over the years has been turned into this ethical, this norm that is unquestionable. But is that how it developed, or did it develop because the mass media came into existence and you needed to put out a product that appealed to both New York and Alabama, and the only way to do so would be to be right down the middle? I don't know. So it's just an instance like that where something that starts out as a business decision ends up being justified as some principled thing. We're not going to jeopardize the government by publishing the entirety of these classified documents. We're only going to pick and choose what to publish based on our editorial discretion. Coincidence or not, that's exactly how the US government differentiated Julian Assange from traditional journalists. Well, Assange didn't redact, he just dumped all the documents out there. A responsible journalist would have, decided what was safe to publish and what wasn't. I would suggest that's probably not a coincidence. Now, on the source end, sources were never really safe from prosecution. The Espionage Act has been applied to prosecute sources plenty of times, most notably under the Obama administration, who prosecuted more sources under the Espionage Act than I believe all of our administrations up to that point combined. Some of that was because the internet was growing and there was just more ability to prosecute those cases. Probably a fear of what would happen if these new era whistleblowers were sort of cut off at the knees. But sources have never really been safe from Espionage Act prosecution. That's why at the Press Foundation we conducted security trainings for journalists. We developed tools like Secure Draft Danger Zone to allow journalists to communicate with sources confidentially and safely, because sources really are taking a big risk when they provide documents to a journalist or to anyone else. They're risking their careers, they're sometimes risking their livelihood. For now, because of the absence of a shield law to protect them, they mostly have to rely on technological tools and ingenuity. Hopefully, the Press Act, which I mentioned again and might mention a few more times, will pass and will provide some additional protection, because we don't know how many stories we miss out on because sources won't come forward.
Seth, I want to bring the other two panels in for panelists, not panels, and for two more panels tonight, for our broader discussions. But I want to go back to the Pentagon Papers case for a minute, because this is a really pivotal First Amendment case, and it's, as Carrie Shankman, who I think has written the best treatment of the Espionage Act, he's a lawyer who wrote a very good issue of the Espionage Act, points out, it's often a very misunderstood precedent, because in the Pentagon Papers case, the Supreme Court rules that the New York Times goes to publish the Pentagon Papers, Nixon administration cites the Espionage Act to stop them, to engage in prior restraint. And the Supreme Court rules, they don't rule you can never do prior restraint. They just rule there's a very high burden, and the Nixon administration didn't meet it. But they are explicitly silent on the issue of whether or not the Times can be prosecuted after the fact. And as Shankman points out in his book, A Century of Repression, after that, the paper stopped publishing information, and it fell on this sort of struggle from Senator Mike Gravel and the Unitarian Universalist Church, Beacon Press, to publish them. So there has always been this open question prior to the Assange case of whether or not you can be punished after the publication, and that we sort of relied on this gentleman's agreement with the nationals. What a great idea, rolling in a gentleman's agreement, national security state. And apparently they didn't think Julian Assange and Wikileaks were gentlemanly enough to abide by it. But I have heard multiple people assert that that the Assange prosecution is set a chilling effect, that is limiting the distribution of these documents. And we do know that the Pentagon Papers decision had that impact. But I've also heard people make a very different argument. For example, Ken Klippenstein has said that this is pointing to a real crisis in journalists, where journalists are refusing to publish information they should. Ken Klippenstein published the J.D. Vance dossier, which was allegedly or actually hacked by Iran. It was hacked by Iran, and no one else would publish. And he put it on Twitter. My understanding is that it's not actually that interesting, and that it doesn't actually tell us anything about J.D. Vance we didn't know. But Elon Musk, working with Trump, banned Klippenstein from Twitter. They stopped distribution of the way they previously stopped distribution of information about Hunter Biden's laptop, which became this sort of cause celebre for Elon Musk to take over Twitter. Turns out he's a liar and a hypocrite who could have seen this coming. Not me, obviously. And he was visited by the FBI.
Yeah, Ken was.
Ken was, yes. So we have a very troubling political moment right now. And I'm wondering if other panelists want to talk about what the Iran leaks and the fact that we are relying on, and I love Ken Klippenstein and antiwar.com and Dropsite News very much, but I don't think most Americans know who they are. Unfortunately, they would be better off. What does it say about the political moment in our, you want to take this question?
I mean, the one thing that I would like to say about that, I think a lot of it has to do with people's proximity to access. They don't want to lose that access. So even like the New York Times, they don't want to step on toes. And it might not even be fear of being, I mean, it's part of it, being arrested and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, it's a business decision, like you mentioned earlier, where if you do those things, you're not going to have access anymore to the Pentagon or to the White House. And now you're going to become like Dropsite News, where no one's really reading you because you don't have access to those things. For me, with a smaller publication, and I'm sure Dropsite probably feel the same way, they don't care about losing those because they never had book access to begin with. So that's why they feel more inclined to take those risks.
Kevin, you wrote a really excellent piece for the Dissenter today. I was reading it on the plane. I think it's the best thing I've read on this topic so far. No pressure, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I wanted to pull back and consider the larger issue, because whenever you have a leak, what happens is we don't talk about the substance of it. And I think that's intentional. Whether journalists know what they're doing or not, those who work for the national security state who are in law enforcement would rather us be talking about the hunt for the source, the hunt for the leaker, than the contents, right? Because they didn't want these documents to be read by people in the first place. And so when you look at these documents, I wouldn't say that they're the most revelatory. They confirm what we know about the US. They're intensively surveilling the Israeli government and their military. They know exactly every single day what the Israeli military is doing to respond to Iran. That's what it reflects. But it also says some things like if you look at the way that there are confidence levels for what they think is happening on the ground at these military bases, it says to you that there are some worries, and we should be a little bit anxious ourselves as Americans that our own government goes around acting so confident, like they know what the Israeli government's going to do tomorrow or the next week. And it says right there that, we don't know for sure if they're going to use a nuclear weapon or not.
And officially, we won't acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons because if we do, we are legally mandated to end all military aid to them.
Yeah, it's actually a violation of the law.
Yes, it is a violation of U.S. law to give military aid to a party who is not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yeah, that make you a nuclear proliferator.
Yes.
Which is what we accused Iran of being. Without
Yes, that's why we're going to let the actual nuclear proliferator bomb go.
Yes. And so
It's a pretty good revelation, though. I don't. Yes.
Yeah, so there's someone who's an analyst, a lower-level position, who's actually tracking all of the stuff that the people who come out and lie about what's going on in Gaza won't acknowledge. Won't say that this government actually has nuclear weapons. And so I just wanted to pull it back, and I also wanted to put the focus on this behavior of journalists. And what they're doing, because what Seth was laying out, that's all of the legal issues around why we truly need more journalists to publish these documents. And when I look at it, I can't figure out what would be compromised as far as sourcing. And if you look at several of the media reports, they actually paraphrase and get into a fair amount of specifics without quoting the document exactly. So I don't know how much. I feel like the information is the same, whether you're putting the actual document onto a website for people to read for themselves, or you are quoting and paraphrasing the document. Someone who works for the national security apparatus would still say you're leaking top secret information. So you're still in their mind committing a crime that you shouldn't commit. So I don't think it's any better, but you see that they don't want to be left out of the story because they look around and they see other sources, other media publications are publishing that. So they could put their head in the sand and pretend it's not there. And I would just say that there's an Israeli military censor, and that CNN and these other organizations, anyone who has people based in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, will usually go through it and actually even have the censor verify what they're going to put out. And there's an argument to be made that Israeli military censor doesn't have to work a lot because there are a lot of journalists that have developed that understanding of what is acceptable, and they don't even bother to go up to that line, and they're okay with not trying to cross it. Here in the United States, we don't have anything like that, and we have media institutions that just proudly censor themselves. I mean, look, I really should read this to you. This is stated like they're proud to be doing this on behalf of the national security state. ABC News is not quoting directly from or showing the documents which appear to detail movement of Israeli military equipment and munitions that could be used in a potential strike. So I don't know why you need to signal that and advertise it unless, what Seth just said, that you're putting this out there so you can say to the government, you're behaving like good little journalists and you do not want to get in trouble with the Justice Department. You don't want your legal department to get a phone call from the lawyers at the Justice Department National Security Division asking you questions about what you did, maybe subpoenaing you, who knows? And right now they don't know if it's a leak or a hack, but it actually functionally doesn't really matter because it's very similar. And the other thing I'll say is, now one of the things they're doing with this let my other colleagues get back in, but one of the things that they're doing now, because we've had the phenomena develop where these documents are surfacing on these apps like Discord, or they're being posted to Telegram, one of the things that's happening now is those groups and their politics and the way in which they talk about news and also their location and where they're based and how they identify themselves, that's being used to discredit the document. But none of that stuff really matters. The document and the content of it is what we need to understand. So when I put together my article, I just wanted people to think about, well, what can happen over the next couple of weeks here? If Israel strikes Iran, I mean, this isn't a press freedom issue, but it's going to affect everyone, and what we do in journalism is going to affect what these journalists are doing in their rights. If they attack, then Iran's going to retaliate. We know that. And if Iran retaliates, we've seen reported in the news that U.S. government and the military has sent over an anti-missile defense system, a sophisticated anti-missile defense system, and there are now 100 soldiers deployed to Iran.
Not authorized by Congress.
To Israel. Not authorized by Congress. So nobody can argue to me that this isn't public interest value documents, because these are things that we should be talking about, but we are not having a public discussion about this. So it's up to us to force that conversation so people can grapple with what it would mean to be drawn deeper and deeper and deeper into a war with Iran. And you don't have to take my word for it. Take activists like Andy Thayer over here's word for it. Take people in Chicago who were fighting with a no war on Iran resolution back in the 2000s so that it didn't escalate. Take people in the military establishment's word for it, because they know that they don't want to go to war. They know the great lengths they went to prevent Donald Trump from launching a war on Iran. So I'll leave it at that, but it's just to make the case that this is public interest journalism, and we shouldn't be hyperventilating about how concerning it is that we're talking about things that are painfully obvious, that the U.S. government has massive surveillance, knows what Israel is doing, and supports whatever Israel is going to do to attack Iran.
For decades and more activists were concerned that someone like Dick Cheney or Donald Trump would start a war for Iran. Now we have an election in which Donald Trump is running against someone endorsed by Dick Cheney. So, we're a nonpartisan group. That's just an objective commentary on the two candidates and their pro-war with Iran stances. So there's a lot of discussion about trying to find the source of this leak. There's a lot of speculation. I don't think it helps us to go into about whether or not it's a U.S. government employee, whether or not Iran hacked the NGA, or the theory that I'm most sympathetic to is that this was distributed amongst the Five Eyes nations. For folks who don't know, Five Eyes is the U.S., Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and that someone in one of those countries really disgusted with Biden and Harris, allowing Israel to start this war, leak the documents in hopes of preventing the war. But either way, there is a call to sort of continue to find sources. The Heritage Foundation, which a lot of people don't realize this issue anymore, played a tremendous role in helping Ronald Reagan roll back the reforms in the 70s of the church. I'm not going to go off on that tangent, but have put forth this document, Project 2025, which we've heard a lot about what it says about abortion or other very important issues. But buried in the intelligence section of Project 2025 is that the Attorney General should use all methods to find leakers and prosecute them. They should repeal the Garland guidelines, and they should also hire more counterintelligence officers to find journalist sources. The FBI is both a law enforcement agency and an intelligence agency. It's one of the only agencies in the world that functions with both types of powers. So you have law enforcement apparatus that investigates crimes and has to follow, in theory, due process. We know police don't really do that. But then you also have the intelligence apparatus, which is much looser government. because it's supposed to be going after foreign spies and other evildoers. Because the main statute that is used to prosecute people giving information to the media is the Espionage Act, that is all done through the Foreign Counterintelligence Division of the FBI. And if you look at the Counterintelligence Division of the FBI's website, they list protecting secrets as being a higher priority than foreign spies and stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which I'm kind of a little bit more concerned with people getting nuclear weapons than Chelsea Manning showing Julian Assange a video of our soldiers killing journalists. But again, I'm not the FBI, I don't set the priorities. Seth, could you talk a little bit what the Garland guidelines are, why this Heritage Foundation call is so disturbing, and I know the solution is the Press Act, but what is the solution?
Or the solution is the Press Act. So the Garland guidelines were drafted in response to surveillance of journalists in the later years of the Trump administration, which at first the Biden administration continued. And they, although more loosely than we might prefer, generally restrict the Department of Justice, federal prosecutors from subpoenaing journalists for their notes, the identities of sources, news gathering materials. There are some things about the guidelines that are great. There's certainly an improvement on the status quo, which was that at the federal level, there is no such protection. 49 states, including Illinois, have press shield laws, reporters' privilege laws. Certain federal circuits have recognized the reporter's privilege. Some, including ours, the Seventh Circuit, really have not. But there has never been a reporter's privilege in the federal court system. So, that leads to a landscape where if your journalist, as many of you know, is talking to a source of vital information that they are considering providing to you, and they say, what do you do to promise me confidentiality? You can't really say that the law takes care of that. You can say that state law takes care of that, but you can't guarantee that if you are subpoenaed, it will be in state court or in Illinois. And dealing with reporter's privilege law has its own problems, which that's another whole tangent. So ultimately, if you want a source to really trust you, you've got to basically convince them that you're going to go to jail for them. And that's a hard thing to tell someone. If somebody tells me they're willing to go to jail to protect my identity, somebody who's got a family tells me that, I probably am going to think, well, you might think you are in this moment, but do I trust you when it really comes down to it? I don't know. So, that's the situation that journalists and their sources are facing. As I said earlier, we will never be able to quantify how many important stories were not told because of that dynamic. We know how many stories were told despite that dynamic. We don't know how many stories were not told because of it. So the Garland memo that Jim was talking about, to some extent, resolved that for the Department of Justice. There were some problems with it. The definition of journalist, although it's a functional definition, an improvement on most state shield laws definitions of journalist, still affords enough wiggle room that federal prosecutors can find a way to say, well, so-and-so is not a journalist because we don't want to make it really convenient for us if they were. For example, Tim Burke, a journalist in Florida, is being prosecuted as we speak at the federal level for finding the video of Tucker Carlson's interview with Ye, with Kanye West, where Ye went on this anti-Semitic rant and said all sorts of other crazy stuff. At the time, Tucker's agenda was to position Ye as this very rational, reasonable person who the liberal media was slandering, and bizarro rants wouldn't really help position him as such. So Tucker just cut that stuff out of here and didn't air it. And this guy Tim Burke found those outtakes on a streaming site that networks upload video to that didn't require him to hack anything. If you had the URL and copied and pasted it into your browser, you could see it too. He just found it. And he's being prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And being deemed a non-journalist by the DOJ because, well, he wasn't working full-time for a news outlet at the time. He had worked for plenty of news outlets before. He was most famous for, he broke the Matiteo story, the catfishing scandal involving the Heisman Trophy winner. The whole Netflix documentary about it. So it's not as though he didn't have a background as a journalist. No one could dispute he was once a journalist, but he had been out of the full-time professional journalism industry for a couple of years, dabbled in political consulting, and somehow through those sorts of factors, which the test in the Garland Memorandum leaves available, the government's able to argue that he is not protected by the Garland Memorandum, which also has no teeth. It's an internal policy. There are no repercussions for violating it. That's, of course, another problem with it. But the biggest problem with it is that it's policy of one administration, and the next administration can just repeal it just as easily as this one enacted it. If the next administration is a Trump administration, it's a pretty safe bet that they're going to do just that. As Jim mentioned, Project 2025 expressly calls on them to do just that. And whether you think Project 2025 is Trump's entire platform or just sort of a menu he's going to order from, either way, he's already said that he wants to lock up journalists who won't hurt their sources. So it's a pretty safe bet that policy is done with if Trump is, which, and even if it continues to exist, it's limited to the Department of Justice. It doesn't apply to civil litigants who subpoena journalists to ICE, which subpoenas journalists to other federal agencies that surveil or subpoena journalists. And the Press Act also, getting back to the surveillance that occurred under Trump, deals with methods other than going directly to the journalist. It deals with surveillance through phone and email providers, through tech providers, which is often the way these things happen.
And that information can be really dangerous. We had the prosecution of Jeffrey Sterling, who was a whistleblower, who was now a board member defending rights of dissent, who was put on trial. He was alleged to have given information to James Risen about a botched covert action against Iran. That seems to be the theme of the night, relations with Iran. And he claims he was not the source. And the evidence they had against him were the phone records of Risen, where he had called Risen. Now, Jeffrey Sterling is a friend of mine, so you're going to say, of course, Chip thinks he's innocent. But he had spoken to Risen because he had also sued the CIA for racial discrimination. The racial discrimination case was dismissed under the state secrets doctrine, which is fascinating. So you have a former government employee, a whistleblower, who has sued the CIA, who has gone to the Senate about this botched Iran program, whose only action was talking to a journalist. And it's not a crime to talk to a journalist. I think Zach would affirm this, and had many reasons to talk to a journalist, and they used that to convict him. And he was sentenced to, how long was he in jail for, Kevin? Was it 3 years, 5 years?
Around 4?
4 years?
Yeah.
4 years. And that is an example of how dangerous this sort of metadata information is. You don't have to directly wiretap the journalist. You can just find out who you're calling. And in the Eastern District, I don't think this would happen in Chicago because Chicago juries tend to produce better outcomes. I'm not just saying that to flatter you, I'm saying that that's a fact. And the Eastern District of Virginia does, where they convicted him. And I do think the Press Act would be a very important step here. I would also note that reforming the Espionage Act so that it could not be used against journalists and their sources would also be a good step. And then also fundamentally reworking the FBI so they could no longer engage in foreign counterintelligence surveillance against journalists, and they could only investigate someone when there was a nexus to the First Amendment, if that person was accused of a crime, which was a very popular proposal from 1988 to 1994. Even Nancy Pelosi supported it, but has completely dropped off the radar of our discussions, and I am desperately trying to bring back into this discussion. So I think FBI reform, Espionage Act reform, Press Act, we have a very light lift here, don't we? Don't stop.
Yeah, we can get that done there.
Stop the bombing of Gaza. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about Assange's case, and then I think we're going to talk about the Palestinian journalists and the killing of them for the rest of the night. So recently, Julian Assange pled guilty to journalism. Officially, he was accused of conspiring to violate the Espionage Act with Chelsea Manning. The conspiracy consisted of Manning obtained the documents, she gave them to him, he received them, he published them. Again, guilty of journalism is not just the name of Kevin's book, it's a factual description of what the government alleges. What is the significance of the Assange indictment, and how does it build off of past Espionage Act prosecutions, and how does it take them further? Kevin, you were both.
Were we talking about the indictment or
The plea.
because to me it's different.
Yes.
Like, and this is my opinion. I'm not going to claim that it is the dominant press freedom perspective. I think it might actually be a slightly diverging perspective, but I would make the argument that the plea agreement isn't as damaging to press freedom as the indictment. That the indictment is in fact what has created the chilling effect and has been the reason why we're so concerned about this, and why even after the plea deal, it's still troubling because it could happen again. And it could happen again to anybody who's in the position that Julian Assange is, where he sort of carves out his space, where he doesn't really have an allegiance to any particular government. He occupies some kind of fringe space intentionally. He doesn't want to be a part of an establishment news media organization. His politics aren't tidy. It's hard to really define and pinpoint. And so you have that kind of person who can be an easy target, and if there's built up character assassination in the press relentlessly year after year, there's nothing to hold the Justice Department back from using that. And in the case of Julian Assange, it's, if you look at the timeline, it's clear that the indictment comes after Mike Pompeo, as CIA director, makes the choice that he's going to mount a disruption campaign against Wikileaks and try to take them down because he's upset that the CIA became a target and was exposed, and that we were all talking about. Much the same way we were talking about Edward Snowden and what he exposed with the NSA, there was a period of time, much shorter amount of time, and it had much more minimal impact. But for 3 or 4 weeks, we were talking about what the CIA could do to plant malware, to send viruses and Trojans and things of that nature to try and hack into people's phones, to use WhatsApp to compromise signal, to use Samsung TVs. They claim that they could actually plant stuff into Samsung TVs, which it's not lost on me that several years later, I think about that when we're observing what just happened in Lebanon with the pagers and the different communication devices that were intentionally exploded to kill Lebanese people. And I'll just say that I speak like that intentionally because the organization that the U.S. government has designated for a terrorist organization, Hezbollah, is actually a political branch, is actually a political party in Lebanon that has people who are in the Lebanese parliament. So it's very, I think, much more debatable, sticky, prickly situation to just outright say those are all foreign terrorists. So I just provide that context. But with Julian Assange's case, to me, that is the big deal, is that it was even the fact that he was indicted. So going forward now, we have to contend with how it could easily repeat itself.
Yeah, well, the indictment, once the indictment's in place, the only way out of the situation is for the government to either drop the case and essentially confess it was wrong, or for it to go the distance and in an acquittal or a reverse conviction. Plea deal, look, of course, nobody's going to fault Julian Assange for taking a plea deal and getting himself out of prison, but it does validate the prosecution. It's not a binding precedent. It's not as though it had gone to an appellate court and there was something in writing that future judges could cite to say that this is okay. That being said, every judge is going to know that it happened. Every judge is going to know the prosecutors brought this case, and it made its way through the system, and ultimately it resulted in a plea deal the way that 90-something% of cases do in this country. So I think there was sort of a wave of celebration that the case was over for admirers and fans of Julian Assange, happiness that he's free. But it might have been a victory for him. I just don't see it as a victory for the free press. The threat of Espionage Act prosecutions still looms, and as more journalists explore alternative ways of getting the news out and try to innovate, try to change what you generally think of as, here's what a journalist does, much like Assange did, they can't really take comfort in the government's assurances that we would never do this to the New York Times or the Associated Press. And I'm not sure that even the New York Times and Associated Press can take comfort in those assurances. But independent journalists, upstart journalists, innovators, disruptors, certainly can't take that seriously, and they've got to contend with that risk. And people who the risk is most real for are the people without the resources to fight it. They're the people without in-house lawyers who will defend. Not only a matter of defending them, frankly, if an independent journalist were charged under the Espionage Act, I would hope that they would get good legal defense through all the organizations out there that provide it. I would hope.
Everyone else in the panel seems skeptical of that.
Okay, well, I said I would hope, but I didn't say
I would hope too.
But it's not only about whether you get a good legal defense once the charges are already filed. It's about who's going to help you navigate the law to get there. Who is going to stop you from over self-censor out of an abundance of caution, because you don't really know what you're allowed to do. You don't really know where the risk starts and how to avoid it. Those are the people that need help navigating these waters, and those are the people who probably aren't going to get it.
Sure. So I want to turn to the situation in Gaza.
Oh, they're just basically describing me. Small publication with no resources.
Do you think if you were vetted under the Espionage Act, you think President Bruce would come here?
No, absolutely not. Especially once they go out spouse.
I think that's a fair fear. I work in that space. I'd like to think someone would come to your.
Well, I hope so. I would hope, but
I would make sure they did. Seth and I would make sure someone came to your
appreciate
defense.
you guys.
Seth can tell you I spend a lot of time yelling at other press freedom groups to take different cases than they're taking, and
Appreciate your work.
I don't know if my yelling gets me any friends. So yeah, today, Representative Jim McGovern led 64 House Democrats in sending a letter to the Biden administration, calling them to do more to pressure the Israeli government to allow foreign media into Gaza. Israel has not allowed any foreign media into Gaza. They have shut down Al Jazeera, not only in Israel, but in the occupied West Bank, where Israel has no legal jurisdiction to shut down news organizations. And this has created a situation where the foreign press cannot cover what is happening in Gaza. But of course, as we know, there are journalists in Gaza. There are Palestinian journalists who are the world's eyes and ears on the ground there. And that for all of our criticisms, I think of a lot of people in the journalistic profession and the ways in which they fail. The Palestinian journalists of Gaza remind us that journalism can be a heroic profession and a noble profession, and is something worth celebrating. They are being killed by the Israelis. They are being killed in part because Israel is engaging in this, in my opinion, genocidal bombardment of what is the most densely populated place on Earth. And when you drop 2,000-pound bombs on, people who are packed in, You're going to kill a lot of people, journalists and otherwise, but we've also seen evidence that they are deliberately targeting journalists. We saw a journalist killed on October the 4th, where they fired artillery fire directly into his window after sending him WhatsApp messages. So we are seeing a wholesale killing of journalists in Gaza. What is the impact on press freedom globally to see this sort of assassination with impunity of the Palestinian journalists in Gaza?
I think it's a chilling effect because even if they were to allow foreign journalists there, there's a fear that they could be next. With Palestine in America, we just released a special edition about dedicated to the journalists in Gaza. I spoke to quite a few journalists that are out there that a lot of the repeating sentiment was that they took off their press vests while they were reporting because it was a target. As of right now, it's not safe for anybody, but literally one described it as a target. And, they weren't just targeting the journalists themselves, the journalists' families as well. There's been instances where the journalists, or Israel waits until the journalist gets home to their families, and then they bomb their location. So it's one person that I spoke to, Hamid Panish, was featured in the edition, specifically told me that he started with WhatsApp messages, went to emails. So they were contacting him in all different types of ways. And he said that at first, the way that he looked at it is he thought it was just a scare tactic. But it turned out that they were very serious because they did bomb his home. He was injured, and he was reporting with with his injuries, and also while looking for food for his family. So at the end of the day, once they know you're a journalist out there, it doesn't really matter. You're gonna if you stop reporting, you're just gonna go out and look for food for your family, which is what Muhammad was doing during a lot of that time. He was afraid that he might be killed during those moments as well. Another journalist that I spoke to in the edition, he lost his mother and his sister on the first day of October 7th. They were sitting down talking about their future together, and they were bombed. And then he lost his mom that day, his sister later on. He was at the hospital, Shifa Hospital, when they first raided that first time. And, he told me how he saw other journalists, because he took off his vest so that they wouldn't know that he was a journalist, but other journalists being lined up and questioned and being told, you think you're a real journalist? So, that has a very chilling effect on the people once you realize that your safety is just basically in your imagination. Like, this is all an illusion, because at any day, you can just be bombed, and because you're Palestinian or because you're reporting on Palestinian issues, it doesn't matter.
And then there's also censorship in the West as well.
I experienced that when I witnessed these kind of things as a kid, and I wanted to be a sports reporter. I get really passionate about Palestine, I get really emotional. And the first journalism course I took was about objectivity. And I felt, I guess I can never report on Palestine. Because there's no way that I can be anything but biased. So.
Just to go on this point some more, I want to point out that last Thursday, the United Nations Special Report on the Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom of Opinion and Expression. The UN experts always have super long names. I think they should shorten them, so I can read them more quickly. Yes. She presented her thematic report to the UN General Assembly. Global threats to freedom of expression arise from the conflict in Gaza. The U.S. delegate during this time expressed his concern about the shuttering of Al Jazeera and killing journalists. No mention that our government is helping to do this, but she found that attacks on journalists, detention of journalists, were one of the big issues. But she also noted that Western countries, media companies took retaliatory measures against their own journalists, usually Arab or Palestinian, for expressing their personal views online or offline. And she explicitly cited an instance where the Los Angeles Times placed restrictions on a number of journalists for signing a letter against killing journalists. And obviously you can say journalists should have some degree of objectivity, but we're now saying journalists can't be against other journalists. It's a little bit troubling. How does the rapporteur's findings comport with your own experience, and what is it like hearing that from a UN
I mean,
expert?
when it happened to me, I thought it was only happening. But as I started, meeting other colleagues, I realized it wasn't just my news, and it is a chilling effect when you have, the government not saying anything about Al Jazeera. That's when people like me or other people who make tweets or sign-ons, it makes it easier for the LA Times to reprimand them because they're going. We talk about it. They want to be in line with the government. A lot of these, institutions are, in cahoots with the government. It's all about the bottom line, access, because no matter how much I apply for press credentials, I'll never get into asking Matt Miller a question. They'll never approve me unless I had the New York Times back, the Tribune back, and that's because they are all. I mean, I'm surprised that they let Goods in there or CTO News sometimes, but they have to sometimes, because if you have a huge following, they have to respect you because they're going to get called out for the kind of thing. At the end of the day, you guys made really good points about how the government and them are in cahoots and they don't want to seem like they're being bad journalists. And it just falls in line with us. We're the easy target, the easy bad guy. Palestinians have always, my whole life, been the easy target, the easy bad people to point their fingers at and say, oh man, those are terrorists. That was always an easy line. So it wasn't a surprise to me to see it still happening, but I do see, because like I said, I'm in a group called the Misha, and when that happened, it was all over our group chat. People were talking about it, and we came out with guidelines, and so we're not that respected of a group yet, but we're getting there to a point where, just like with my magazine when we first started 10 years ago, we had very small readership, everything was growing, but it's not changing fast enough.
What can people do to support your work, your magazine, support Amnesia?
So I know you guys can follow Amnesia on social media.